The morning sun cast long shadows across the tranquil waters of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Sailors aboard the USS Arizona went about their Sunday routines, some preparing for church services, others writing letters home to sweethearts and families on the mainland. The massive battleship, launched in 1915 and weighing over 31,000 tons, sat majestically in Battleship Row alongside 7 other capital ships of the United States Pacific Fleet. Captain Franklin von Valkenburg stood on the bridge, unaware that he was witnessing the final moments of America's peacetime innocence. At approximately 600 miles northwest of Oahu, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded a strike force that represented the finest of the Imperial Japanese Navy. 6 aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku cut through the Pacific swells in perfect formation. The early morning air buzzed with the sound of preparation as 353 aircraft prepared for what Japanese planners called Operation Hawaii, though history would remember it by another name entirely. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda adjusted his flight goggles as he climbed into his Nakajima B-5 Kate bomber. As the mission's air commander, he carried the weight of Japan's strategic hopes on his shoulders. The plan was audacious in its scope and devastating in its potential. A surprise attack designed to cripple America's Pacific Fleet, and by Japan. The time needed to establish an impregnable defensive perimeter across the Pacific. The geopolitical tensions had been building for months. Japan's expansion into Southeast Asia had prompted increasingly severe economic sanctions from the United States, including a crippling oil embargo that threatened to strangle Japan's war machine. Emperor Hirohito's government, led by Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, saw only 2 choices: submission to American demands or a preemptive strike that would secure Japan's access to the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had studied at Harvard University and understood American industrial capacity better than most of his colleagues. He harbored deep reservations about attacking the sleeping giant, famously predicting that Japan might run wild for 6 months or a year, but questioning what would happen if the war continued for 2 or 3 years. Nevertheless, he had crafted a plan of stunning precision and daring. As dawn broke over Pearl Harbor, Rear Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, was preparing for a round of golf. Intelligence reports had indicated possible Japanese movements, but nothing suggested an imminent attack on Hawaiian soil. The base maintained a peacetime posture, with ammunition locked away and many of the anti-aircraft guns unmanned. Most personnel expected another quiet Sunday in paradise. The irony was palpable. America's military leaders had anticipated that any Japanese attack would likely target the Philippines or the Dutch East Indies. Pearl Harbor, sitting over 2,000 miles from the nearest Japanese base, seemed too distant and too well defended to be a realistic target. This miscalculation would prove catastrophic. At 0700 hours, the first wave of Japanese aircraft approached Oahu's north shore. 183 planes, 49 high-level bombers, 40 torpedo bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 43 fighters flew in perfect formation toward their unsuspecting target. The element of surprise was complete, the weather was ideal, and the American Pacific Fleet lay at anchor like sitting ducks. Commander Fukuda looked down at the peaceful harbor spread below him, American flags fluttering in the gentle morning breeze. In minutes, those flags would be surrounded by smoke, fire, and the screams of dying men. The attack that would transform Pearl Harbor from a quiet naval base into an eternal symbol of American resolve was about to begin. At 0755 hours on December 7th, 1941, the tranquility of Pearl Harbor shattered. Like glass, Commander Mitsuo Fukuda's voice crackled across Japanese radio frequencies with the code words that would echo through history: Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. The message confirmed what Admiral Nagumo had desperately hoped. Complete tactical surprise had been achieved. The first bombs fell on Ford Island in the center of Pearl Harbor, sending geysers of water and debris skyward. Seaman First Class James Rasmussen, stationed aboard the USS Utah, watched in bewilderment as what appeared to be a military exercise suddenly revealed its deadly reality. "Those are real bombs," he shouted to his shipmates, but his words were nearly drowned out by the thunderous explosions that began to rain down across the harbor. Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey at the Ford Island Command Center immediately grasped the situation's gravity. At 0800 hours, he transmitted the message that would alert the world: "Air raid Pearl Harbor X, this is not drill." The simple phrase, repeated across military networks, marked America's violent entry into the Second World War. The Japanese attack unfolded with devastating precision. Torpedo bombers swept in low across the harbor, their pilots having trained for months on a mock-up target that perfectly replicated Pearl Harbor's layout. The USS Oklahoma took multiple torpedo hits on her port side and began listing heavily. Within minutes, the 31,000-ton battleship had capsized completely, trapping over 400 sailors inside her overturned hull. Desperate banging could be heard from within the ship's metal tomb as rescue crews worked frantically to cut through the thick steel plating. Captain Mervyn Benyon of the USS West Virginia displayed remarkable courage as his ship absorbed 7 torpedo hits and bomb strikes. Despite suffering mortal wounds from bomb fragments, he remained at his post, directing damage control efforts until his death. His executive officer, Commander Roscoe Hillenkoetter, later described Benyon's final moments with profound respect, noting how the captain's dedication inspired his crew, even as the ship settled into the harbor's mud. According to naval historians, referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive 15-volume History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, the attack's first wave achieved devastating results. Across multiple targets simultaneously, the USS Arizona suffered the attack's most catastrophic single moment at 0806 hours. A modified 16-inch armor-piercing shell, converted into a bomb by Japanese engineers, penetrated the ship's forward magazine. The explosion was visible from 20 miles away, sending a massive fireball nearly 1,000 feet into the air. The blast vaporized the forward section of the ship and killed 1,177 sailors and Marines instantly, including Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg and Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd. Amid the chaos, individual acts of heroism began to emerge. Doris Dory Miller, an African-American mess attendant aboard the USS West Virginia, assisted his wounded captain and then manned a .50 caliber machine gun, a weapon he had never been trained to use due to racial segregation policies. Miller shot down at least 2 Japanese aircraft before being ordered to abandon his position, becoming one of the attack's first heroes and later receiving the Navy Cross. The harbor's waters turned black with oil, much of it ignited and creating a hellish landscape of fire and smoke. Rescue boats navigated between burning patches of sea, pulling survivors from the water while dodging continued strafing runs from Japanese fighters. Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class John Harley found himself treating burns so severe that traditional medical protocols proved inadequate. "We did things we'd never been trained for," he later recalled, "because the textbooks never anticipated anything like this." As the first wave of attacks concluded around 0830 hours, a temporary lull settled over the harbor. Survivors used this respite to organize rescue efforts, fight fires, and prepare for what many correctly anticipated would be a second assault. The psychological impact was already profound. America's sense of invulnerability had been shattered in less than an hour, and the isolationist sentiment that had kept the nation out of the war was dying along with the men trapped in the harbors. Burning ships. At 0900 hours, just as Pearl Harbor's defenders began to comprehend the magnitude of the first assault, radar operators detected the approach of the second wave. 170 Japanese aircraft, 54 high-level bombers, 78 dive bombers, and 36 fighters screamed toward Oahu under the command of Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki. Unlike the first wave, which had achieved complete surprise, these attackers would face increasingly organized and desperate resistance. The second wave encountered a dramatically different reception. American anti-aircraft batteries that had been caught unmanned during the first attack were now fully operational and manned by grimly determined crews. The USS Nevada, despite suffering significant damage, had managed to get underway, the only battleship to do so during the attack. Her movement sparked both hope and concern among American defenders, as her escape might inspire other ships, but her potential sinking in the harbor channel could block the entire port. Lieutenant Lawrence Ruff, piloting a Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, was among the few American pilots who managed to get airborne during the chaos. Taking off from Halewa Field, he and Second Lieutenant Philip Rasmussen engaged Japanese dive bombers over the harbor. Despite being vastly outnumbered and flying obsolete aircraft against superior Japanese Zeros, these pilots demonstrated remarkable tenacity. Ruff managed to down one enemy bomber before his own aircraft sustained heavy damage, forcing him to crash land in a pineapple field. The second wave focused heavily on Pearl Harbor's infrastructure, fuel storage facilities, dry docks, and the submarine base. Japanese planners recognized that destroying these targets would cripple American recovery efforts far longer than sinking ships, which could eventually be raised and repaired. However, the increasingly fierce anti-aircraft fire and the presence of American fighters forced many Japanese pilots to abandon precision bombing in favor of survival. Petty Officer First Class John Finn manned a machine gun at Naval Air Station Kaneohe Bay despite suffering multiple wounds from strafing runs. For over 2 hours, he maintained his position, shooting at Japanese aircraft while blood flowed from 21 separate wounds. His extraordinary courage under fire would later earn him the Medal of Honor, making him one of 15 recipients of America's highest military decoration for actions during the Pearl Harbor attack. The USS Shaw, in dry dock for maintenance, provided one of the attack's most spectacular moments when her forward magazine exploded at approximately 09:30 hours. The blast sent the ship's bow flying through the air in a massive fireball that photographers captured in what would become one of the war's most iconic images. Miraculously, many of Shaw's crew survived the explosion, though the ship appeared to be a total loss. Chief Petty Officer John Crawford aboard the USS California displayed exceptional leadership as his ship absorbed the torpedo hits and began settling by the stern. Despite the vessel taking on thousands of tons of water, Crawford organized damage control parties that kept California from capsizing entirely. His efforts, combined with those of other crew members, allowed the ship to settle upright into the harbor's mud, facilitating later salvage operations. As referenced in Gordon Prange's definitive work At Dawn We Slept, The Untold Story of Pearl Harbor, the second wave's effectiveness was significantly reduced by American defensive measures and the psychological impact of witnessing their comrades' destruction during the first assault. By 09:45 hours, the last Japanese aircraft disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind a scene of unprecedented devastation. The harbor burned with multiple fires, sending thick black smoke thousands of feet into the tropical sky. 8 battleships had been sunk or severely damaged, along with 3 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, and numerous auxiliary vessels. 188 American aircraft had been destroyed, most caught on the ground during the first wave. Yet, amid the destruction, signs of American resilience were already emerging. Damage control parties worked tirelessly to save what ships they could. Medical personnel treated hundreds of wounded despite inadequate supplies, and military leaders began planning for the long war they now knew was inevitable. The attack had succeeded beyond Japanese expectations in terms of immediate damage, but it had also awakened a sleeping giant whose response would prove far more terrible than Admiral Yamamoto had ever imagined. The smoke-filled hours following the Japanese withdrawal revealed the true magnitude of Pearl Harbor's devastation. As rescue teams worked through the wreckage, the human toll became heartbreakingly clear. 2,403 Americans had been killed, with 1,178 wounded. The USS Arizona alone had become a tomb for 1,177 souls, their bodies entombed forever within the twisted metal of what had been the Pacific Fleet's pride. Chief Hospital Corpsman Alfonso Medina found himself overwhelmed at the Naval Hospital, where corridors overflowed with casualties suffering from burns, shrapnel wounds, and injuries from jumping from burning ships. We had never seen anything like it. Medina later recalled, boys with burns covering 70% of their bodies, sailors with their clothes blown off by explosions, Marines with shrapnel wounds that defied description. Medical personnel worked without rest, performing emergency surgeries in hallways when operating rooms reached capacity. The psychological trauma proved as devastating as the physical wounds. Seaman Second Class Russell McCurdy, who had survived the Arizona's destruction by being blown overboard during the magazine explosion, spent hours floating in oil-covered water surrounded by the bodies of his shipmates. You couldn't tell who was dead and who was alive. He remembered decades later. The oil was so thick and there was so much debris. You just kept swimming and hoping someone would find you. Harbor Master Captain William Furlong immediately recognized that Pearl Harbor's strategic value hung in the balance. The Japanese had failed to target the fuel storage facilities and submarine base adequately, an oversight that would prove crucial in the coming months. Furlong coordinated salvage operations while simultaneously preparing defenses against a potential invasion that many believed would follow the air attack. His quick thinking helped preserve the harbor's functionality despite the massive damage. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, faced the devastating reality that his fleet had been reduced by nearly half in a single morning. The loss of battleship strength was catastrophic, but Kimmel recognized that the harbor's repair facilities remained largely intact. Within hours of the attack's end, he had teams assessing which ships could be salvaged and returned to service. The USS Nevada, despite running aground to avoid blocking the harbor channel, could be refloated. The USS California and USS West Virginia, though sunk, had settled in shallow water where salvage was possible. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt received word of the attack while reviewing naval correspondence at the White House. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox's telephone call at approximately 1:30 Eastern Time brought news that would fundamentally alter American history. Roosevelt immediately understood the attack's implications. Isolationist sentiment would evaporate overnight, and America would enter the war with overwhelming public support. This means war, he told his aide Harry Hopkins with characteristic directness. As documented in Walter Lord's meticulously researched Day of Infamy, the attack's timing had significant political implications, occurring while Japanese diplomats in Washington were supposedly engaged in peace negotiations. The news spread across America through radio broadcasts that interrupted Sunday afternoon programming. Families gathered around radio sets, listening in stunned silence as reporters described the devastation. In movie theaters across the nation, screenings stopped as managers read bulletins announcing the attack. The American public's reaction was immediate and unified. Shock transformed rapidly into determined anger. Congressional leaders received emergency briefings as Roosevelt and his advisors crafted what would become one of history's most memorable speeches. The president worked late into the night, personally editing the address that would ask Congress for a declaration of war. He insisted on the phrase "a date which will live in infamy," rejecting more diplomatic language in favor of words that would resonate with the American people's sense of outrage. Military installations across the United States went on immediate alert, with commanders fearing coordinated attacks on the West Coast. False alarms led to blackouts in San Francisco and Los Angeles, while coastal artillery units prepared for naval bombardment that never came. The fear was palpable and understandable. If the Japanese could strike Pearl Harbor, no American territory seemed safe. By midnight Hawaii time, Pearl Harbor had begun its transformation from a scene of destruction into a symbol of American determination. The fires still burned, the oil still spread across the harbor's surface, and the rescue operations continued. But already the massive effort to rebuild and strike back had begun. The attack had succeeded in damaging the Pacific Fleet, but it had also unified America in a way that years of political debate had failed to achieve. December 8, 1941. Dawned with America fundamentally changed. At 12:30 in the afternoon Eastern Time, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress. In the packed House chamber, his words broadcast live to a nation still reeling from the previous day's assault. His 6.5-minute speech, interrupted repeatedly by thunderous applause, began with the immortal words that would define December 7th forever. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The president's voice carried a controlled fury that resonated with millions of Americans listening on radio. Roosevelt deliberately chose simple, direct language that contrasted sharply with the diplomatic complexities that had preceded the war. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory, he declared. His words met with sustained cheering from lawmakers who had been deeply divided over foreign policy just 24 hours earlier. Within 33 minutes of Roosevelt's speech, Congress voted for war with only one dissenting vote. Representative Jeannette Rankin of Montana, the first woman elected to Congress and a committed pacifist, cast the sole no vote, stating, "I want to be the only one to vote against this war." Her decision effectively ended her political career, but demonstrated the principled opposition that had kept America neutral for over 2 years. Admiral Chester Nimitz received orders to assume command of the Pacific Fleet, replacing Admiral Kimmel, who bore the political responsibility for Pearl Harbor's unpreparedness. Nimitz arrived in Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day, 1941, to find a scene that would have discouraged a lesser man. The harbor still reeked of oil and smoke. Twisted metal protruded from the water like grave markers, and the morale of surviving personnel had reached its lowest point. Yet Nimitz possessed the vision to see beyond the immediate devastation. The Japanese made 3 of the biggest mistakes an attack force could make, he observed. Or God was taking care of America. The fuel storage facilities remained intact. The submarine base was operational, and most crucially, the aircraft carriers had been absent during the attack. Nimitz recognized that Pearl Harbor could be rebuilt stronger than before, and the Pacific Fleet could rise from its own ashes. The salvage operations became a testament to American engineering and determination. Captain Homer Wallen, the Navy's salvage expert, arrived to find ships that many considered total losses. The USS Oklahoma had capsized completely. The USS Arizona was a burned-out hulk, and the USS California had settled deep into the harbor mud. Yet Wallen and his teams began the seemingly impossible task of raising these giants from their watery graves. The USS West Virginia's salvage proved particularly challenging and symbolic. Divers working in the ship's flooded compartments discovered that some crew members had survived the initial attack, but died trapped in sealed compartments. Calendar markings found in these spaces indicated that some sailors lived for days after the attack, slowly running out of air in their steel prison. These discoveries added a haunting dimension to the harbor's tragedy, while strengthening the resolve of those working to restore America's naval power. As referenced in the comprehensive account Pearl Harbor, From Infamy to Greatness by Craig Nelson, the speed of American recovery efforts amazed even Japan's military planners, who had expected their attack to cripple Pacific operations for at least a year. The attack's psychological impact extended far beyond military circles. Japanese Americans across the continental United States faced immediate suspicion and eventual internment, a dark chapter in American history that revealed how fear and prejudice could overwhelm constitutional principles. Executive Order 9066, signed by Roosevelt in February 1942, authorized the forced relocation of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of whom were American citizens. Hollywood responded quickly to the attack, with director John Ford's documentary December 7th winning the Academy Award for Best Documentary Short Subject. The film helped crystallize Pearl Harbor's place in American mythology, portraying the attack as a treacherous assault on an innocent, peaceful nation. This narrative, while emotionally powerful, simplified the complex geopolitical circumstances that had led to war. By the attack's first anniversary, Pearl Harbor had been transformed from a symbol of American vulnerability into an emblem of resilience and determination. The harbor bustled with activity as repaired ships prepared for offensive operations across the Pacific. The battle cry, "Remember Pearl Harbor," had joined "Remember the Alamo" in America's pantheon of rallying calls, inspiring everything from war bond drives to recruitment campaigns. The transformation was complete. Pearl Harbor had evolved from a devastating military defeat into the foundational myth of America's greatest generation. The months following Pearl Harbor's attack witnessed one of the most remarkable salvage operations in naval history. What had seemed like total devastation on December 7th gradually revealed itself as a recoverable catastrophe, thanks to the extraordinary efforts of naval engineers, civilian contractors, and thousands of determined workers who refused to accept defeat. Captain Homer Wallen, appointed as Pearl Harbor's salvage officer, surveyed the wreckage with the methodical precision of a surgeon examining a critical patient. The USS Nevada, though beached and damaged, could be refloated relatively quickly. The USS California and USS West Virginia, despite being sunk, had settled upright in shallow water where diving operations were feasible. Even the completely capsized USS Oklahoma presented engineering challenges that American ingenuity could potentially overcome. The salvage of the USS California became a symbol of American determination. Divers worked in pitch-black conditions inside the flooded battleship, guided only by touch as they sealed compartments and installed pumps. Chief Machinist's mate Peter Tomek had sacrificed his life ensuring the ship's boilers were properly secured, preventing explosions that would have made salvage impossible. His posthumous Medal of Honor recognized not only individual heroism, but also the forward thinking that made recovery feasible. Lieutenant Commander Edward Ellsberg, a naval engineer and author, documented the salvage operations with remarkable detail. His teams developed innovative techniques for underwater welding, created specialized equipment for sealing massive hull breaches, and established procedures that would revolutionize naval salvage operations. The work required not just technical skill but extraordinary physical courage. As divers repeatedly entered flooded compartments where deadly gases, unstable debris, and the ever-present risk of compartment collapse threatened their lives, the USS Oklahoma presented the most daunting challenge. The 31,000-ton battleship lay completely upside down, her superstructure buried deep in harbor mud. Conventional wisdom suggested she should be written off as a total loss, but American engineers refused to accept defeat. They developed an unprecedented plan using massive A-frame structures and winches to slowly roll the enormous vessel, a process that would take nearly 2 years to complete. Civilian contractors played crucial roles in the recovery effort. Hawaiian Dredging Company, Pacific Bridge Company, and other local firms worked around the clock, their employees understanding that Pearl Harbor's restoration directly affected Hawaii's security. The attack had demonstrated the island's vulnerability, and only a fully operational naval base could provide adequate protection against future Japanese assaults. The human dimension of the salvage operations revealed remarkable stories of dedication and sacrifice. Boilermaker First Class James Forbes spent months working inside the flooded hulls of damaged ships, welding patches and installing pumps in conditions that would have challenged professional cave divers. His work, repeated by hundreds of others, gradually brought the dead ships back to life. As documented in Rear Admiral Homer Wallen's official report, Pearl Harbor, Why, How, Fleet Salvage and Final Appraisal, the salvage operations eventually recovered ships worth hundreds of millions of dollars and proved that American industrial capacity could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The psychological impact of successful salvage operations proved as important as the material recovery. Each ship raised from Pearl Harbor's depths represented a victory over Japanese aggression and proof of American resilience. The USS California's return to service in January 1944, completely modernized with advanced radar and anti-aircraft systems, demonstrated that America had not merely recovered from Pearl Harbor, it had grown stronger. The USS Cassin and USS Downes, destroyers that had been severely damaged in dry dock, were rebuilt using salvaged machinery installed in new hulls. These zombie ships carried the names and battle honors of their predecessors, while incorporating the latest naval technology. Their resurrection perfectly symbolized America's ability to transform disaster into opportunity. By 1943, Pearl Harbor had regained its status as the Pacific Fleet's primary base. The harbor teemed with activity as newly constructed ships joined refloated veterans. In preparing for offensive operations against Japan, the submarine base, largely undamaged in the original attack, had become the launching point for a devastating campaign against Japanese merchant shipping that would eventually strangle Japan's war economy. The transformation extended beyond ships to personnel and procedures. Pearl Harbor's defenders had learned bitter lessons about preparedness, intelligence analysis, and inter-service cooperation. New radar installations provided comprehensive coverage of Hawaiian airspace, while fighter aircraft maintained constant patrols. The base that had been caught sleeping would never again be vulnerable to surprise attack. Most significantly, Pearl Harbor's resurrection provided inspiration for the massive military buildup that would carry America to victory across the Pacific. The transformation of Pearl Harbor from military disaster to cultural icon represents one of the most remarkable evolutions in American historical memory. Within months of the attack, December 7th had transcended its immediate military significance to become a defining moment in the American national consciousness, a touchstone for discussions about preparedness, sacrifice, and national unity that continues to resonate more than 8 decades later. Hollywood played a crucial role in cementing Pearl Harbor's iconic status. The 1970 film Tora, presented a remarkably balanced account of the attack from both American and Japanese perspectives, using actual combat footage and consulting with surviving participants from both sides. The film's title, taken from Commander Fukuda's famous radio message, entered popular culture as shorthand for surprise attack and military disaster transformed into eventual victory. The USS Arizona Memorial, dedicated in 1962, became the physical embodiment of Pearl Harbor's transformation from tragedy to inspiration. Architect Alfred Prees designed the memorial to sag in the center, while remaining strong at both ends, symbolizing initial defeat and ultimate victory. The memorial's location directly over the sunken battleship, where oil still seeps to the surface in what locals call black tears, provides a powerful connection between past sacrifice and present remembrance. President Ronald Reagan's 1984 visit to Pearl Harbor demonstrated the attack's enduring political relevance. Speaking at the memorial, Reagan declared, December 7, 1941, was a day that changed America forever. It awakened us to our responsibilities as the leader of the free world. His words reflected how Pearl Harbor had become not just a memory of American vulnerability, but a justification for global military engagement and international leadership. The attack's survivors became living links to a pivotal moment in American history. Annual December 7th remembrance ceremonies at Pearl Harbor drew thousands of visitors, including veterans, their families, and tourists seeking connection with what Tom Brokaw would later call the greatest generation. These ceremonies evolved into elaborate productions featuring military bands, honor guards, and increasingly elderly survivors whose presence lent authenticity to the commemorative rituals. Academic historians contributed to Pearl Harbor's iconic status through intensive scholarly examination. Gordon Prange's At Dawn We Slept, published in 1981 after decades of research, provided unprecedented detail about the attack's planning and execution. Roberta Wohlstetter's Pearl Harbor, Warning and Decision pioneered the study of intelligence failures, making Pearl Harbor a case study in organizational dysfunction and the challenges of threat assessment. The rise of conspiracy theories paradoxically enhanced Pearl Harbor's cultural significance. Claims that President Roosevelt knew about the attack in advance, while lacking credible evidence, reflected the event's central importance in American historical memory. The fact that such theories persisted despite thorough debunking demonstrated Pearl Harbor's power to inspire passionate debate about government transparency, military preparedness, and the acceptable costs of strategic deception. As referenced in Emily Rosenberg's comprehensive study A Date Which Will Live, Pearl Harbor in American Memory, the attack became a template for understanding later national traumas, from the Kennedy assassination to the September 11th attacks. The 2001 film Pearl Harbor, directed by Michael Bay, despite mixed critical reviews, demonstrated the attack's continued commercial appeal and cultural relevance. The film's romantic subplot and spectacular special effects attracted new generations to Pearl Harbor's story, even as historians criticized its historical inaccuracies. The movie's global box office success of nearly $450 million proved that Pearl Harbor's appeal transcended American audiences. Educational curricula across America ensured that Pearl Harbor remained a cornerstone of historical instruction. High school textbooks invariably included detailed accounts of December 7th, often presenting it as the moment when America abandoned isolationism and embraced its destiny as a global superpower. This pedagogical emphasis guaranteed that successive generations would understand Pearl Harbor as a fundamental turning point in American history. The attack's technological dimensions gained renewed relevance in the computer age. Pearl Harbor became a case study in the importance of intelligence sharing, technological innovation, and the vulnerabilities of complex systems. Cybersecurity experts frequently invoked Pearl Harbor when discussing the potential for digital attacks on critical infrastructure, extending the attack's metaphorical power into the 21st century. Today, Pearl Harbor stands as perhaps the most recognizable date in American military history, its significance extending far beyond the immediate military consequences of December 7, 1941. The phrase "Remember Pearl Harbor" has joined "Remember the Alamo" and "Remember September 11th" as rallying cries that encapsulate complex historical moments in simple, emotionally powerful language. The attack's transformation from devastating surprise assault to iconic symbol of American resilience represents a unique achievement in the construction of national memory. Pearl Harbor succeeded in becoming not just a historical event, but a foundational myth that continues to shape American identity, foreign policy, and military culture. In achieving this transformation, Pearl Harbor fulfilled Admiral Yamamoto's darkest prophecy. The attack that was meant to cripple American power instead awakened a sleeping giant whose response would echo through history.